So let's go to what is private Google access. So VM instance that only have internal IP address can use private access. So they can reach external IP address of Google APIs and services. If you disable private Google access, the VM instance no longer can reach Google API services. They can only send traffic within the VPC network. So as you remember, when I created my VPC, so you might have noticed one option, right? Google private access, as I told you
Yeah.
here.
Right.
Google private access. So this is very important when you working with the Citrix MCS. Okay. So for example, if you deploy, let's say you have a VPC here. Okay. You have a subnet one. On top of it, you will have a VM. There is something called Google APIs. Okay. So these APIs can be either can be reached over the public internet or using within the cloud also you can reach it. Okay. So now your VM, if they wanted to access the Google APIs, by default, it will go to the default route, as I told you, right? 0.0, it will go to internet. But to go to internet, your VM should have public IP address. Without public IP address, it cannot go to internet. That is the basic fundamental things which is required for the outbound traffic. So you need to have a public IP address, then only you can reach, or you should have something called proxy IP, or let's not talk about proxy and all, because we have a separate session there. Okay, so in general, you need public IP address to go to internet. Let's say you are like nobody will deploy public internet, public IP address to the VMs, right? Your session VMs. So why it is required, not required. So in that case, if you don't assign public IP address, right? So it won't be able to access Google APIs from the internet. So now, since you are already in the Google Cloud, Google have the option using your internal IP, right? It can reach your Google APIs internally directly, because these are all in same cloud. That is why. So when you enable that option, right? So when you enable this option, which I showed you, when I enable this option, private Google access, then using internal IP address, it can reach the APIs. Okay, but when you turn off the option, it cannot able to reach, because this service is blocked. So you're not able to go anywhere outside the network. Okay, so to do machine provisioning through MCS, so MCS requires Google API access. Okay, so for that, always make sure that you turn on that option so that it can reach to the Google APIs. Clear, right?
But you said like one thing, like outbound is already open for that one. Inbound is blocked, but outbound is, so why the public access is required still?
See dear, outbound access, as I told you, outbound access by default enabled. Okay, so by default, as I told you, right, by default you can go anything from your VM to outside as far as you have a public IP address. You got my point?
Okay.
If you don't have a public IP address, how your traffic will go to internet? You clear?
Yeah, understand.
Yeah. So if you have a public IP address, this private access is not at all coming in picture, because you can directly access it from the internet. When you remove the public IP address from your VM, you cannot able to browse Google or whatever it is.
Correct.
That time you have to enable this private access. Okay, we will
Understand.
see this in demo. Okay.
Understand. So
Yeah.
this private access address you enable on the VPC level, correct? Like
Yes, VPC level.
so all the
Yes.
VM which is deployed, they will access the all
Yes,
the
Google.
out. Okay, got it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Mamal,
So
you mentioned that like when you enable public IP address, that was like the computer that you use it to communicate your GCP workloads, right? It's not like we are attaching the public IP directly onto the VM on the GCP.
see, I'm talking about the VM. Let's say let's tell you something. When you deploy VM, right? Second. Yeah. See, when you deploy, let's say this is your VPC. Okay, so when you deploy any VM, right, by default.
Sorry to interrupt. Screen is not shared.
Oh, is it? You're able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so now you have a VPC, you have a subnet. Okay, that is 10.1. 1.0, okay, /24, and the IP address of this is 10.1.1.2. Okay, this is the IP address. You did not define any public IP address while creating the VM, just for an example. Now, when you do not select any public IP address from like while creating a VM, then your VM, right, it cannot able to communicate to internet. This is your clear, right?
Yeah, this part I'm clear.
Okay, now you have a Google APIs here. Okay, Google APIs. It is nothing but APIs which is required to deploy MCS machines or any other APIs. Firebar, there are some APIs are there. So this is hosted in like Google Cloud itself. It is a PaaS service. Now to reach this, either you need public IP address, isn't it? It will traverse like this and it will reach the Google APIs through internet. Correct.
Right.
Okay, now you did not select public IP address to this virtual machine, so now it won't be able to reach like this from the internet. Okay,
Right.
so now you need to reach the Google APIs anyhow. So that's why you enable private access. The moment you enable private access, right, it can reach like this using the internal IP address itself.
Yeah, if I remember it correctly, like you have used your computer's public IP, right? When you searched your public IP and
Yeah.
then you added your public IP there.
Forget about my computer IP address. Like I'm not talking about my computer. My computer IP address is just to do the RDP. That's it. I'm talking about the VMs. For example, your VDI. From VDI, I'm talking.
Okay. So we
So
haven't
nobody will
created it.
assign public. My question is, nobody will going to assign public IP address to VDI, isn't it?
Right, right, right.
That time you have to enable this option so that it can reach the Google APIs. You got my point.
Okay, so now if I understood this correctly, like when you enable private access, GCP itself will add a public IP to that particular VM. Is that what am I understanding correct?
GCP won't use public IP address. It will use internal IP itself. That is the beauty.
Okay, okay, okay,
Because
got it.
when
Yeah,
you use public IP address, like it doesn't make sense, right? Because it is,
yeah, I'm clear now.
yeah. So because see, this APIs as well as your VM, at the end it is all hosted in the same GCP cloud, isn't it? Maybe in a different location.
Right.
So that is why it
Okay.
is talking to, through this private access through the internal IP itself. Okay.
Yes, we
So
use term of
why
public
you
IP.
created this one public private? So it means you are using the MCS service, so communicate to that publicly GCP. That's the purpose, correct?
Yes, we
Okay.
enabled because
Hmm.
MCS requires Google APIs to
Yep.
provision the VMs. That is why.
Okay.
Because if you don't provide communication to Google APIs, right, your machine
Hmm.
provisioning will fail.
Fail. Yeah, got it. I understand
Okay.
now.
Yeah. For example, if you don't want to use MCS, you want to provision using manual method. For example, you have a server. You on that server you installed the VDI and you're manually adding it to the machine catalog. That time you don't require APIs because you're not using MCS. You got my point.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
Okay.